So thank you very much to all of you. And I will now introduce our panel by alphabetical order. We're doing a low protocol panel here. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Saleh Al-Kharabsheh. He is Minister for Energy and Mineral Resources for Jordan, which has limited natural resources but abundant renewable potential. And the government's renewable energy and energy efficiency programs have achieved demonstrable success in promoting the shift to a green economy based in part on new market models. And we're going to hear about that a little bit more in just a moment. And seated next to me, it's a pleasure to welcome Liu Baohua. I hope I more or less got that right. He's Vice Minister of China's National Energy Administration, NEA. It has pledged to invest over 350 billion euros in renewables by 2020 and to close down over 100 coal-fired power plants. The IEA describes the scale of China's clean energy deployment, together with technology exports and foreign investment, as a key determinant of momentum behind the global energy transition. So pleasure to have you with us. And in the middle, we have Irene Muloni. She's Minister of Energy and Mineral Development for Uganda, which is endeavoring to meet rising demand for electricity with a program to boost private investment in renewables that spurred Bloomberg ratings to rank Uganda in second place in Africa for renewable energy investment. So great to have you here to tell us more about that in just a moment. And then we will skip over to Cedrik Neike. He is member of the managing board at Siemens. He is the technology and engineering giant. Siemens is a world leader in terms of installed renewable capacity and its wind power business. Siemens Gamesa is one of the world's foremost suppliers of both on and offshore solutions. So great that you can be with us. Seated next to him is Terje Søviknes. He is Minister of Petroleum and Energy for Norway. Due to its vast hydro potential, the renewable share of energy production in Norway is already at 100%. Yet Norway is also one of the largest global exporters of oil and gas. So we'll hear shortly what lessons can be learned from this rather unique transition model. And finally, it's great to have with us Francesco Starace. He is Chief Executive Officer and General Manager of Enel. Approximately half of the electricity that Enel produces in its worldwide operations comes from non-fossil sources, with 36 gigawatt of installed capacity. And the company has been rated a world leader for its vision in adapting its business model to the energy transition. So we're very much looking forward to hearing more about that. So I'm going to ask you to get us started, all of you, by telling us briefly, in just 3 minutes, if you can, because we really want to make the most of our time, what your countries or your companies are doing to shape markets and to boost the role of new market actors, what tools and levers you're relying on, and what kind of challenges you're facing. And we're going to start with the policymakers and then go to industry. And given the fact that this is a male-dominated sector, I would like to begin with Madam Muloni and ask you to give us a sense of Uganda's experience with liberalized power markets. How did things change for your country with unbundling?
Thank you very much.
Should be on. Go ahead. Try it again. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Uganda has taken on liberalization and privatization as one way of attracting the private sector to join into the energy markets. And this was done for the reason that you need to invest heavily in the energy market over a longer period of time. And at times, you find that governments are not able to support the investments by themselves. And so the private sector comes in handy on board to join governments in developing the energy markets. So Uganda as a country embraced the liberalization and privatization policies in the early 90s, and we have indeed progressed very, very much by opening the energy sector for private investors to join us in participation, and we've seen growth in energy capacity, in efficiency, and in access. But having achieved that, there still remain challenges that we need to still tackle to ensure that the private sector participation brings on board efficiency, but also the bottom line of affordability and sustainability. And these remain key challenges for us as we continue with the partnership, developing capacity in renewable energy sources, improving efficiency to ensure sustainability, the bottom line of affordability of electricity services becomes a key challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And in fact, we are going to be talking about access at different points throughout the conference. So thanks very much for reminding us how important that topic is. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to now put on my headphones, and I suggest you do the same because our next speaker will speak in Chinese. And I would like to come now to Vice Minister Baohua from the Chinese NEA. Your country is head of the class, rated #1 on clean energy market competitiveness, for example, by Bloomberg. Nonetheless, you do also still have a high share of coal. So I wonder if you would please share with us your vision of the energy transition as it is happening in China.
Thank you. Yes. So hello, everybody. So hello to everybody first. So actually, China really is committing itself strongly to a green and low carbon economy. And sure, the scale is large, but also the goal is very high. So on the other hand, we have a very short experience in using new and renewable energies. But on the other hand, traditional energy still have a huge share, so which means we have to throw in a lot of very hard efforts to make the transition successful. And of course, the developed countries have a history of more than 100 years in using carbon and traditional energies. However, in China, we only have about 50 years in traditional energies, so experience. And then we tried to use petrol to replace carbon, so coal. And so we have gone through several steps of replacement. And the first step was that we had a huge development in burning oil instead of coal. And now we are already in the coal, so we already crossed the coal peak. And we do not use coal anymore to cover our peak needs in energy supply. And the major share in rising, so the major rising share are non-traditional energy sources. And we are still growing in energy. And the demand has already reached its peak. And we hope that gas will also then more or less replace coal as the major source of carbon and of fossil energy. And the Chinese government pays highest attention to the energy transition. And we have put this at a prominent place in the 13th five-year plan of national development. And we have a number of policies we have a national action plan which was published in 2016 and should cover 2016 to 2030. And we have the strategic goals for the energy transition. We have the strategical development of a green, low-carbon energy. We have a new energy mix. And we want to make sure that non-fossil energies grow up to at least 15% by 2020. And by 2030, we want to reach 20%, and gas should claim 15% in that energy mix. And we are still working hard to phase out of coal as soon as possible. And in order to achieve these goals, we have a number of policies to streamline the energy mix. And we have reached some successes in the last 5 years, which help us to reach our goals. And coal, so the share of coal declined by 8.1 percentage points, and the consumption of gas increased over 60% in the last 5 years, and its proportional share increased also by 6%. So this is the biggest change in the energy mix which we have seen in the last 5 years. And then non-fossil energies now already have reached 38 percentage points of the whole energy mix, and we are now talking about 660 gigawatts in generating capacity in renewable energies. So if we add hydropower, nuclear power, wind power, and solar power, then we can safely and securely claim the first position in a global scale. And we still have a blueprint. We have for our work, which we are facing. So energy transition and climate change are the big issues we're working on. And this is also, you should also see this in the context of the 19th party meeting last November, which was a historical transition also for the Communist Party of China. And Xi Jinping, State Secretary, Xi Jinping also made it a goal on that party meeting that China successfully walks the path of the energy transition towards a green and low carbon society. And we have to reduce the carbon, the coal share in our energy mix. And we have to make sure that in the 10 years starting from 2020, the non-traditional energy sources like hydropower, nuclear, wind, and solar power will still continue to increase. And clean energy and the total commitment to clean energy is something which is a major decision for China, given its past. And we have seen that the energy development of China has to be more liberated, has to be more open. The power generation sector has to undergo more structural reforms. And so we talk about 4 revolutions here and 1 cooperation strategy. So we have the energy generation revolution, we have the consumption revolution, and we also need more international cooperation in this sector. And driving forward with the energy transition is something which certainly has national characteristics, but China is totally committed to doing so. And all the colleagues from abroad in the international arena, we welcome you to cooperate with us on an equal footing and on a level footing. And in order to really achieve the huge goal of the world, of the global energy transition, we have to collaborate and work together. Thank you very much.
And I will ask you to tell us a little bit later on in the next round about the exact mechanisms and policy tools that you're using to get there. So many thanks to you for that. Let me go now to Minister Al-Kharabsheh from Jordan. And you, like China, are in fact in the top 10 on that Bloomberg Clean Energy Competitiveness Index that I mentioned. Your country has limited natural resources, so how important is it to you to diversify the current energy mix with projects that are developed by the private sector? And how can you boost overall investor confidence, the willingness of the private sector to devote capital to this endeavor in the Jordanian energy sector?
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Thanks to Germany for organizing this important meeting. As you mentioned, Melinda, Jordan has really very limited conventional resources, but it has abundance of renewable energy resources, mainly solar and wind. So to reduce the burden energy bill puts on our economy and our budget, we decided to rely more and more on our local resources, mainly renewable energy resources. And let me say we have started a little bit early. Some serious steps were taken when we prepared our strategy back in 2007. Back then, we bought a very ambitious target to reach 10% of our energy use comes from renewable energy resources by 2020. Back then, we all know the cost of renewable energy systems were high, and that target was really perceived as difficult to achieve. But we were determined to get to that target. So what we started to do to see what are the barriers, what are the challenges that face renewable energy projects to materialize. We identified those barriers. We characterized them into three main categories. One related to the legislative legal barriers, and financial commercial one, administrative and technical ones as well. So we started with the legislative, the legal barriers. We put in place a legal framework that is conducive to the investors. We put in place renewable energy law, a very modernized law, and we issued the bylaws according to that law that protects the investors and really encourage them to invest in this field. In the financial sphere also, we put in place the system of feed-in tariff. We granted all renewable energy projects 100% tax exemption from customs duties, and for something like 75% from income tax duties. For the technical and administrative, we put in place clear and transparent procedures on how to deal with those projects, and we started working in that field. We experienced some delays to attract private sector to come and invest in this important sector. So we from the government took very bold steps in putting some projects, implementing those projects through the central government, through the government, to encourage. We wanted to have a flagship project to showcase for the investors that we have something on the ground that is working. Now, the target we put for 2020, we will exceed that target. By 2020, we will have 25% of our electricity generated from renewable solar and wind. That's why we are looking into our strategy. That's 2007-2025. We will extend the timeline for that strategy. We'll put more ambitious targets towards 2030 and 2050. We continue to work with the private sector under the power purchase agreements. Now we have something like 20 investors in the generation side. 6 of them work in the conventional energy projects, and the remaining 14, 15 IBB developed renewable energy projects. So now we are thinking of developing the system that we follow, maybe moving from single buyer model to more liberalized market where consumers can choose directly who will provide them with their electricity from the generation part. This is only one of the 3 models that we use to encourage and to promote the use of renewable energy projects, that direct proposals where developers sell electricity to the public-owned utility. But there is another scheme that we follow, wheeling. For large consumers, they can construct their own power generation project, solar or wind, and we allow them to use the transmission network that's owned by government-owned utility to consume it wherever their consumption centers are, and there is also the feed-in for small consumers. So we have those 3 models. That's why I think we succeeded so far in achieving our target.
Thank you very much for that very concrete explication of what Jordan is doing. And let's move from an energy importer now to an energy exporter. And 2 questions, if you would, Minister Søviknes. The first one, getting at that very unique situation I mentioned earlier, how does Norway take part in a green transition when it's already at 100% of renewables? And second question would be how your gas exports fit into the European energy transition, and in particular, as that transition does gather speed and demand for fossil fuels falls, how Norway believes it will need to reposition.
Thank you, and thank you very much for being invited to this important conference, especially our German hosts. Norway is blessed with natural resources, also when it comes to energy. So it's correct, we have a surplus of renewables, and at the moment we are a net exporter of renewables as well. But of course the oil and gas is the largest sector. But from our point of view, there is no contradiction between being a large oil and gas producer and take part in the energy transition. And I can give you a couple of examples. Natural gas is a fast and cheap way for rest of Europe to reduce their CO2 emissions by switching from coal to gas in power generation. UK is the most prominent example. Over the last 2 years, they have reduced coal-fired power generation by 60%. And they have reduced their CO2 emissions by 25 million ton annual. And that's about half of Norway's altogether CO2 emissions. And a lot of the coal was replaced by gas in this switch. And it's also an example that a price on carbon with their carbon floor is working. Additional, we are working nationally to use electricity in other sectors than before, especially transport sector, because we have to reduce our emissions as well, and we need to reduce it in transport sector, in the agriculture, and so on. And in the transport sector, you might know that we have had a tremendous success with our policy framework for electric vehicles. Last year, 40% of new car sales were electric vehicle or hybrid electric vehicles, and it's a tremendous development over a couple of years. So it's possible, but of course we are a small country and we have used large incentives to reach this goal by tax exemptions and other benefits for EV cars, like free toll roads, free public parking and charging stations and everything. So we need infrastructure and you need incentives for the consumers, then it works. So we are taking part in the energy transition, being a large producer of both fossil fuels and renewables. And I think for several decades, we will need especially natural gas for this coal-to-gas switch, and we will need oil in some sectors like aviation, heavy-duty transport, maritime sector, and of course in petrochemical industry. But it will be less over the next decades. But as all serious scenarios tells us, we still need a lot of oil in the foreseeable future. So we will be there as a large and reliable supplier of energy for Europe especially.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me now come to our private sector panelists and ask you to reflect both on what you've heard so far. Maybe you have comments on some of that, and also to talk a little bit about how you see markets developing in future. And I'll begin with you, Mr. Neike. Siemens has worldwide experience. You yourself are the board member for Asia Australia. So perhaps you could give us a comparative perspective on how your company is seeing different countries managing their respective transitions and how a private sector actor like Siemens is supporting them.
Perhaps I go. Hello? Yeah. Perhaps I go a step back and just to describe Siemens. I mean, we're a 170 years old company, and basically our business is either producing energy, distributing energy, or consuming energy. So we're looking at the complete value chain. And as part of that, if you look back, Werner von Siemens discovered the dynamo principle, which basically was electricity. And you said it very nicely. Actually, only a small part of the energy consumption is electricity at the moment, between 20 and 30%. Most of it goes into heating, mobility, etc. So we as Siemens put a lot of energy to see, the vision is how do we electrify the world and how do we decarbonize the world? Because the one thing I see in Asia or I see in Europe is that actually the Paris Accords are global. Everybody wants to go decarbonize. So in order to decarbonize, you actually need to have clean technology, and we have, and you said it very nicely, 85 gigawatts of wind power, but you also need to look at how can you reduce the consumption of energy and how do you move a lot of the energy consumption into electricity, which is what we do. So of the 5.2 billion of R&D we have, a lot of our energy goes into how do we make a more electrified, a more decarbonized world happening. And this takes a lot of help, and we want to collaborate with governments, and we want to do this because something which we heard early on is there's still 1 billion people without electricity or not clean electricity. So we work with governments to actually take complete countries and migrate them into a newer, cleaner, and more efficient world. And Egypt is one. I've our colleague from Egypt. We work together on 50 gigawatts on building the most advanced energy production in terms of clean energy and gas to be able to take the country forward into sort of a next generation energy environment. And it's important because we work very closely with the German government to do it, to see what are the best knowledge which we could copy from Germany and help countries leapfrog this energy transition in advance. Now, the one thing which we have is it's not enough to produce clean energy, which is what we're focusing on. Is also the one thing is because we're big in industry is how do you reduce energy consumption? And the only way to do it is actually digitally link the different verticals, digitally link the energy production, the energy distribution, and the energy consumption. And that's why Siemens has put a lot of effort. We spend more than $10 billion acquiring software expertise. We're 170 years old. We know how to generate energy. We know how to distribute energy, but we need to make it also as digital as possible to be able to make it as efficient. And we do this very, very, in a very advanced way. And the great thing is, we take this, if you go to Korea, if you go to Indonesia, everybody asks, what about the Energiewende in Germany? What can you teach us? And we basically share what we've discovered here in Germany. But there's other places like China. If you look at what China does in terms of generating energy 3,000 kilometers away from Shanghai and building a high voltage line to sort of transition back, we partner actually with China because there's things we can learn out of China also. So it's a give and take in this world. So what I was trying to say is, in order to address this Energiewende, we need to think holistically about production, distribution, and consumption. We cannot do it alone. We as Siemens partner with little startups like blockchain startups in Brooklyn. We partner with industry to reduce the energy consumption. We partner with leaders like Enel to actually think, how can we make this grid more intelligent? And we partner with countries like Egypt and other countries to be able to help in this energy transition. So there's a lot of activity. You have to think holistically, and we try our best to actually drive this in a very collaborative, but with a clear vision that this world needs to go decarbonized.
Thank you very, very much. Let me now ask Mr. Starace to talk about the utility perspective. And of course, the energy transition has delivered a very deep shock to your industry. We saw that poll question that was posed by Janelle a little bit earlier on. 50% of our audience does say they think at least some traditional utilities will survive the energy transition. And certainly Enel is a shining example that this doesn't have to be a death knell. So from your perspective, on the basis of the success that Enel has had, how can utilities best adapt, and what do you need from policymakers to really ensure that, for example, you can play the most constructive possible role? And among other things, I'm thinking about EU policymakers. We heard Mr. Šefčovič talking about the package that he's looking to finalize in the coming year. So perhaps your thoughts on that as well.
Thanks. And this is a set of very heavy questions, I would say. Eh? So first of all, thanks for organizing this great event about the transition, because the transition is not only happening in Germany, it's happening everywhere in the world in different ways. In fact, I was answering "we'll see" in the question, okay? I did not say no. I said that we'll see. But it depends, really, because what happens is all around us. It's a huge change that is thrown at the utility world by technology. Technology is basically driven by two things. One, Cedrik mentioned before, is the digital world. So what digital is doing to the industry and to its customer base, that's really, really deep. And then another huge force that is changing the industry is the incredible advance in material science. So materials with which things are made improve year after year, and they are lighter, they are cheaper, they last longer, they perform better, and they are more efficient. So the combination of these two forces is the real explanation of why renewable energy has become so competitive nowadays. After becoming global, it became competitive because things are made with things that perform better. That's the real reason. And this change is not something that you can govern or control. It happens anyway. It's not something that you can push back. It's there. So as this part of our activity, which is the generation activity, and mind you, this is a part of our value chain in which most of the discussions typically sits. We always talk about generating energy, and this generation part is transitioning now from thermal to renewables because of competitive advantage. There are increasingly frequent cases in many parts of the world where the cost of energy generated by a new plant is cheaper than the marginal cost of generating with existing power plants, which means they're doomed to go out. Which means no one invests anymore in these kind of things. And because our is a big industry in terms of investments, we are very careful where we put our money. So if you look around in Europe today, you don't have a lot of thermal power plants being planned, not even constructed. And the reason is because we know that in the next 10 years, maybe there is not even a case of discussing one of them as far as the investment is concerned. So this is the depth of the transition. But because, you know, we go back 50 years after the war, so maybe 70 years at this point, we have a lot of assets that need to be transitioned out and a lot of investment that has to come in to substitute them. And this will take 15 to 20 years. That's the transition time, but it will happen. And as it is happening elsewhere in the world too. So what happens is when a system is progressively decarbonized through renewables, we observe two things that always happen. Number one thing is the cost of energy at wholesale level goes down. And number two, this cost stabilizes over the years. So it's no more volatile as the commodities were before. So as electricity is becoming cheaper and stays cheap for a long time, then it becomes useful for other things. Then you can start to use electricity to heat. Then you start to use electricity to transport, and you can use electricity to cook and do things. So we are lucky because due to this transition, our business, the business of electricity, gets bigger, which is great from our standpoint. We love it. However, there's something else is happening which is not so great, or it's a fact that not only things are getting better, they also become more efficient. So they use less electricity to do the same job, which is fine. So at the end of the day, we will sit in a world that will become less energy intensive, and this is in fact happening. GDP per use of electricity per unit of GDP is going down. Going forward, it's going to be less energy intensive, more decarbonized, much more electrical, and it will need a lot of investment in a part of the value chain of which we never talk about, which is the distribution part. The networks that connect things, that bring electricity to things, need to be digitized if we want this to happen. And the investment in digitizing network is one of the most difficult things for regulators and legislators to understand. So if I can just close this initial remark, please pay attention to the networks. They need careful eye, because if you forget the networks, dear ministers, your systems will not really carry on with the transition. They will reach a certain point and then they will stop there. So you need to look at this small thing, the networks, that we always forget. They need a lot of attention. They are a very sexy part of the value chain. They need a lot of technology, and they can become incredible value creation opportunities. Thanks.
Thank you for that very clear message. Many thanks to you. So I'd like to get Janelle up here on stage to share with us what we have heard so far from the audience. Maybe you have a question or two that we also want to pose to the panel before I go back to them with the second round.
Not particularly directed at anybody, but here's one. Who are the new market actors of the energy markets in transition?
That's exactly the question I'm going to be posing in our next round of questions. So we'll save that one, please.
All right. What are the main opportunities of the new market reality caused by the liberalization of markets?
Okay. Let's take that one and put it, because essentially that's what our panelists have just been talking about.
All right, so to the person who sent that question, the answer is coming. And who are the main beneficiaries and who are the main losers of the energy markets in times of transition? So winners and losers.
Yeah, okay, very good. We will add that to the next round as well, I think.
Thank you. And do not forget, if there are any more questions you'd like to add, please use the hashtag BETD and follow us at greensofa_BETD. Thank you.
Thanks so much. No comments, no...
Well...
And have we got a change on that poll on the utilities?
If you'd like a look, am I connected? All right, briefly.
We're doing the digitalization of networks thing right here and now.
Am I connected
Live
now?
on stage.
Am I connected now? Still not.
All right, we'll work on that and get you back up at the end.
But just one thing, though, there has been a lot of reaction to the comment that Norway sees no contradiction between the energy transition and continuing its fossil fuel business. Something to pick up.
What's the reaction? Just give us one or two.
Well, I would like to be able to show it. Is it still not showing up? A question emoji.
A question emoji, okay.
From many sides.
Okay.
That has been the main one so far.
Thank you so much, Janelle. We'll get you back up on stage at the end for a little bit more feedback.
Thank you.
Let me, in fact, come to all of you with a second round of questions on new market actors and new market relationships. And if you want to talk about winners and losers while we do that, also welcome your comments on that as well. And I'll come again to you, Minister Muloni, to start with how the unbundling of the power sector has of the power industry has benefited the private sector, whether you have seen the rise of new actors and maybe some losers as well? Go on, it's on.
Yes, okay. Thank you once again. Of course, when we embraced liberalization and privatization, it meant that we opened up the market for the private investors to join us. And in so doing, we needed to restructure the entire sector. Originally, as a country, we had the Uganda Electricity Board that was vertically integrated. It was generating electricity, transmitting electricity, distributing and selling electricity, and regulating itself. So for us to embrace the private sector into the energy market, we needed to unbundle. And that saw the creation of 3 companies, the generation, the transmission, and the distribution. It saw the creation of a regulator, because now we were embracing the private sector to come on board, and that we had to ensure that there was a level playing field. It also saw the creation of the Electricity Disputes Tribunal, so that we are able to expedite any electricity disputes. But at the same time, because government's responsibility was to ensure that every Ugandan has access to electricity, there was creation of a rural electrification fund and therefore agency for accelerating rural electrification. At that material time, in terms of capacity, we were only generating about 60 megawatts. The losses in the sector were above 31%. The collection efficiency was about 63%. And the connections where customers were accessing electricity were just a mere about 200,000. And therefore, the access was extremely low. Numerous outages. So in terms of reliability, it was really low. And staff productivity was very low at about 30%. And of course, the financial position and the operational performance of that system was almost at 43%. Tariffs here were highly subsidized by government at about 67%. So when we did the liberalization and attracted the private sector to join us, we saw a good number of the private sector come and join us in the generation. Right now, we proudly talk about 20 independent power producers, and they are producing over 70% of our energy in the system. For your information, Uganda is endowed with abundant renewable energy sources, so our energy mix, about 90% is renewable, and the 10% thermal is for purposes of energy security. And 70% of this energy is actually produced by the private sector. We also saw the distribution sector attracting investors. The way the structuring of these sectors was done was largely through long-term concessions. And so we have about 6 power distributors from largely the private sector. Now, the Rural Electrification Agency continues with the accelerating rural electrification, and where access is extended, some of these areas are again packaged as concessions and handed over to the private sector to manage. Right now, we are proudly talking of a boost of 950 megawatts from the 60 megawatts that I talked about. And in the next 2 years, this is going to more than double because we have 2 huge hydropower dams under construction. The sector was also structured to have a cost-reflective tariff so that the subsidies that government was putting in were now focused on how do we increase capacity and access so that all Ugandans are able to achieve an electricity service. And in so doing, the incentives and the arrangements to attract more private sector into the area, we ensured that there is a feed-in tariff for 20 megawatts and below so that there is predictability as required by the private investors. We standardized the power purchase agreement and also implementation agreement so that they fast-track negotiations with the private sector. And of course, in all this, we've seen the customers increasing to 1.2 million, and the electricity access is now at about 22%. We still have a long way to go, but we are seeing the direction that we are going. We now see where effort needs to be put, what needs to be done, where the private sector can come and join us. And so all this is resulting into growing demand for electricity. And whereas the earlier time we were chasing capacity, now it is demand that we are chasing because we've been able to overcome the challenge of capacity. Now we are chasing demand. We want industrialization to take root in the country because we have plenty of products that we are growing. We need to add value. And so setting up value addition industries, which definitely will require electricity throughout the country. So the government has a program of setting up 25 industrial parks across the country, and that means we must have enough electricity generated, we must transmit it across the country and be able to distribute and increase access. And all this we are doing so that we are able to ensure that the energy market in the country is sustainable. And above all, as I said, the issue of the tariff remains really pertinent. My president directed that I don't want manufacturers to buy electricity at more than $5. So you can see the challenge that is on my shoulders. But in all this, you can see that the private sector has definitely come in heavily, and the government monopolies have been broken, and so the power markets are actually creating opportunity for the private sector to participate with a good return on investment, and therefore creating fairness and transparency in the power markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you see me making a few little hand gestures, dear panelists, because I am very aware of the time. We've got a minister's lunch, so we're going to have to end fairly punctually. Therefore, I'm going to ask your answers, if possible, to be pretty brief. But I'd like to stay on this topic of new market actors and come to you, Vice Minister, to ask what China is doing quite concretely to shape markets and boost the role of new market actors, and what kind of vision you have for the future in that particular area.
Well, thank you very much, Melinda. There are lots of potential beneficiaries of the energy transition. In general terms, we have the whole of society as a beneficiary. everyone stands to benefit from a better environment and more sustainable development track. Specific beneficiaries, firstly, in the clean energy value chain, every segment of the chain, manufacturing, installation, and operation of clean energy power equipment, they all stand to benefit. In China, there have been more than 10 million jobs provided by solar and wind power sectors, and there'll be more jobs coming from there. Secondly, now I've heard the intervention from the traditional energy operator. Traditional energy operators stand to benefit too. If we look at coal power plants in China, there's a concentrated and intensive effort to transform them into clean coal power plants with emissions levels at or lower than gas-powered power plants. If we take the whole of this year and the whole of next year, we will end up with 70% of Chinese coal power plants which have come down to or below the emissions levels of gas-powered plants. That will be an extraordinary achievement, and there are many related companies, including my friend at Siemens here, who will enjoy opportunities in that process. Thirdly, there will be new installations of equipment, including in the heating sector, in areas around Beijing. 3.5 million homes have been fitted with electric heating to replace fossil fuel heating, and we will be expanding that. So a lot of producers of related equipment stand to benefit. Of course, the traditional electrical network operators also stand to benefit. That goes without saying. And coming to those, traditional utilities, the grid in China has seen a lot of expansion and interconnection, including plans to interconnect with neighboring countries in the future. And there will be a significant amount of opportunities to be enjoyed in that process too. Thank you very much.
We'll come back to that issue of interconnection across borders also in just a moment. But I'd like to come first to Minister Al-Kharabsheh from Jordan and ask what kind of new business models Jordan is seeing as a result of both the renewable energy and energy efficiency programs that I mentioned earlier, and also in particular what kind of public-private partnerships, local and international perhaps, are needed to further promote innovative approaches on the market.
Well, thank you. Maybe as I mentioned during my initial remarks, the electricity sector in Jordan is completely unbundled. Now we have the generation for the private sector. The transmission, it remains at the hand of public-owned utility, and the distribution also for the private sector. What I think we can do to promote more renewable energy penetration, going into the issue of converting our grid to smart grid, digitalization of the grid, and moving maybe from the model of single buyer to more free market, open market, so that consumers can choose who will be their suppliers, and the transmission network as an infrastructure can be utilized and used by anyone. What we are trying also to do for more penetration of renewable energy is to enhance the interconnection with our neighbors. We are interconnected with Syria, with the Palestinian Authority, with Egypt. We signed an MOU to be interconnected with Saudi Arabia, and today I was talking to my colleague from Iraq. So interconnection will promote projects for the private sector. Our private sector and some developers, they already started talking about the possibility of setting power plants, solar power plants, and export that electricity to neighboring countries utilizing the existing infrastructure. So that's a very important move, benefiting from the availability of resources in some countries and the need for that electricity in different times during different peak periods. So I think if we make that move, upgrade our infrastructure, convert it into a more smart network, more and more renewable energy projects can come in reality, and the interference or the intervention of the government then will be minimal. It will be pure commercial transactions between the private generators and the consumers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And perhaps to Minister Søviknes, also the same question about cross-border link up and cross-border trade, because of course, as you say, you are in the position of being a very significant exporter of energy. And I wonder what market mechanisms you would like to see put into place in future to facilitate more effective cross-border linkages.
Thank you. First of all, we have to bring with us that the Norwegian and the Nordic countries' electric market was liberalized in the 1990s. So we have a couple of decades with experience, and it's extremely important for us as politicians that we don't pick losers or winners. We are there to yes, give us well-functioning markets and efficient markets, both through regulations and through infrastructure, physical infrastructure. And when it comes to interconnectors, it's important for the Nordic countries, but it's also important for the northern part of Europe. At the moment, we are building 2 new interconnectors between Norway and Europe, one to UK and one to Germany, the NordLink. And of course, if we are going to use the potential in these interconnectors to benefit both Germany, UK and Norway, we need the grid at both sides to be efficient as well. And that's a large question in Germany, I know, with the link between the north and south when it comes to the electricity. But it's important for us to make well-functioning markets and use the price signals. And we use new companies, old companies, the small startups, the big major companies, both within the energy sector and other sectors, to meet the climate agreement and reach the goals. So cooperation is a key word between governments, cross-border, and between governments and the private sector. We need an effort from all of us.
Thank you very much. Did you want to say just a word about the emoji that was put up there in response to your earlier remarks?
I know I would get that reaction from someone, but it's important when we know are moving forward and we have this energy transition that we can have 2 thoughts in our head at the same time, because the world needs more energy and we have to use both natural gas and oil, fossil fuels, for several decades coming up. And it's important to use all tools if the main goal is to reduce CO2 emissions and do it fast and at a cheap way. Then a switch from coal to gas is an important tool as well. So we can't just focus on one tool. We have to use the whole toolbox.
Thank you very much. And speaking of the tools, Cedrik, Neike, I would like to come back to the digitization issue that was mentioned before by Mr. Starace, because you spent many years working for Cisco. So I wonder where you see parallel developments between IT and energy, and whether you think the energy guys and girls have something to learn from the techies.
They have something to learn from the techies, but the techies have a lot to learn also from the energy girls and guys. So let's go a step back. I mean, the one thing, if you look at the telco market which happened, it created a lot of winners and losers. But at the end, the consumer won, which was a very important point. But fundamentally, 6 out of the 8 main manufacturers of telecom equipment which existed for 100 years don't exist anymore. The main major winners of were not the classical utilities or telecom providers, but actually were the Googles and the Facebooks, because the value was completely redefined. So there's things which we need to learn. Now, coming from the telco sectors, I have to say I'm partly amazed on how much progress we've done on the renewables, and partly shocked on how dumb the network still is. The telco network used to be very dumb, and the internet made it intelligent. And there's a law in this space called Metcalfe law, which says the more intelligent endpoints you have, the more valuable your network is. The reality is I don't know if you know, 100% of the transport networks are digitalized in most of your countries, but a maximum of 5 to 10% of your distribution networks, which means most of the networks, and you only use 1 or 2% of the data, which is when something goes wrong. So there's so much data which exists in these networks which is not being used to make it more stable, more efficient, and we have to address it. And Germany, and that's my call to Germany, Germany did an amazing job going to the Energiewende. We went from 1990, 1,000 power plants, in 1990 with 1,000 power plants in Germany. We now have 1.6 million power producers, which don't consume but also give energy back. This is a digital problem to be solved, and we have to solve it. So back to your question, transitions always completely reshapes the value chain, and either you win or lose. It's not because you've been successful in the past that you are, and that counts for a country as much as for a company. And the second thing is we have to, and Francesco said it very nicely, we have to forward invest in this network, because the network is what's actually going to make the energy transition either successful or not. It's important to do storage, it's important to do renewables, it's important to go to gas. I believe gas has a role to play for quite a while in terms of stabilizing the network, but you need to understand how energy gets distributed and how you balance the network. Or the worst thing which can happen is a blackout. We said it at the beginning, as Heiko Maas said, a blackout. We calculated if Germany would have a blackout which lasted more than a couple of days, it would be chaos. So we need to think about how do we bring digital capabilities, especially as we build new networks in Uganda, China, everywhere, that need to be intelligent to be able to work in a completely more decentralized logic than they originally were intended to. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Very interesting. And Mr. Starace, I'd like to ask you to just briefly address something else that's going to be a theme in other sessions here at the conference, and that is finance, because there is a growing interest from investors, institutional investors, asset managers, and others in sustainable financing instruments. And I wonder what that means for conventional or formerly conventional utility like Enel, and how you see that affecting strategy.
Yeah, I think this is the growth of the ESG sector or sustainable finance has been quite dramatic in the last years. This has to do, in my opinion, with two things. The first one, it coincides with the growth of automated or artificial intelligence trading. You say, what is the what's the link between this and that? There is a link that if you put algorithm in charge of your investment choices, they do a lot of clever things, but they can also bring you in very, very odd situations, because algorithms don't understand exactly human beings, and they don't understand exactly what happens to sustainability. It cannot be handled by algorithm. So why is there a selective choice? Because you minimize the risk of making huge mistakes, in particular reputational mistakes, when you invest through algorithms. If you add to that an ESG layer, so if you select environmental and social responsibility portfolios, and then you let the algorithm play with those only. So this is a little bit of a risk mitigation measure. It's a bit cynical to say that, but it is unfortunately the case. It's a big risk mitigation sector that many portfolio managers today have. That's one point. The other one is that indeed there is a lot of money that does not want to be associated with unsustainable practices and wants to change the world for the better. I think the second part will prevail over the years, and it is increasingly large. The effort that the industry is making is to, let's say, put down metrics and identify tools that can explain in numbers what sustainability and shared value creation is, which is not an easy task. Okay, but so far we've been quite successful, I would say. And if you put at it, if you work with that, then you also have another benefit in the company. That is, you focus the efforts on only sustainable business practices. So you don't just have an investor relation function that does sustainability, because that's fake. But you put the sustainability down in the line, in the shop, wherever you're doing the job, and that stimulates a lot of innovation. I mean, it's incredible the amount of innovation that coupling sustainability with your business practices, how much innovation is released, because you need to change the way you do business if you want to do it sustainably. You know, unfortunately, I've been in this industry for many, many years. I might say unfortunately because I would like to be a little younger. So, so it happens that sooner or later we get there. So, so I have been in this industry so long that I have seen, in retrospective, myself doing unsustainable things. Only I was not aware of it, because it was a different era. Today, we have things that we cannot accept anymore, and how to make sure that the company, that is a huge company, it's more than 50,000 people, so you cannot go one by one. And then you have to put this concept in the head of people through a very detailed effort. After that, then the ESG funds relax and they give you their money. As today, money is so cheap, there's really no difference. So it's not true that there is a competitive advantage from a funding standpoint at all today. Maybe in the future, not now. In fact, it's just more burdensome and it has a little bit of a complication. But the added value for a company that wants to stay in business for the next 10, 20, 50 years, that means you have to do sustainable business practices. That's a big value. That's the value that we see in there. And that's why we like to go into that direction.
Thank you very much. Great last words for our panel. Before we part, I'm going to ask Janelle to come back up and give us any more feedback that you may have gleaned.
Exactly. There was actually one more final question from the crowd, if we have time.
Sure.
And this is for Siemens and NL. What do the panelists from Siemens and NL think about the huge imbalance in energy taxation? Is that not a showstopper for efficient use of electricity, among others, for heating?
Can we answer? Yeah. Who likes taxation? Anybody here? Apart from the finance minister.
We have a whole panel.
Okay.
We have a whole panel coming up on carbon taxes, and we do like carbon taxes.
All right. So in general, I think we would like energy to be relieved from taxation, at least to have a uniform taxation across the board. I think taxation is increasingly a large part of the energy bill of a house, of a factory, of a commercial center, of a building like this. Whether we like it or not, it's there. And I think it is an indirect competitive advantage or disadvantage between energy forms, between businesses across countries. So an homogeneous taxation, at least at energy level. I'm not advocating a free tax energy because that would be too much, but at least a uniform taxation would be much better. It will show the intrinsic competitiveness of one technology versus another in a much more easy way, and of course it would be good for the industry. But
can I be unfair and actually ask a counter question, Francesco? What about carbon tax?
Yeah.
So,
you know, I think
we all love.
I think carbon tax is one of the many ways with which you can push out coal and push out carbon in general from the mix. I think it will be difficult to switch to carbon tax, a system that has never been used to it. So you have to go through some carbon costing exercise. It can be the scheme that the EU has decided to implement. So let's go through that, because if we start discussing carbon tax from scratch, we will not do anything for another 10 years. So I would say my easy way out of this is, please, let's go through the ETS right away and not in 2021. And then, after maybe 2, 3, 4 years, we can switch to something else, because we get used to pay some carbon cost somehow. But so far, we're just discussing, and that's what I don't like at all. I like to see something coming.
So, and I want to give, I mean, I agree with you, so I'm not going to go forward. I want to talk about tax, but also subsidies. Without subsidies, the green energy technology would not have been developed the way it is in Germany, for example, for wind or for solar. Yeah. So there needs to be support. We're just building, for example, the greenest hydrogen production in Austria at the moment. We announced it yesterday. And it is with subsidies from the EU. So whilst I'm not a big subsidy fan and I want taxes to be as low as possible, we need to see, is carbon tax steering the investment in the right direction or not? And second one, do we need subsidies to kickstart some technologies to actually go and bridge this valley of death as it's being sort of described? So that would just be my annotation, and I think you had another sort of view also on this one.
Just one sentence, if you don't mind, Minister, because in fact we have a whole panel on carbon pricing and taxation after lunch.
I will be short, but actually carbon tax works, especially when we use it on one sector, as we have done in Norway. 1991. We had a quite high carbon tax on the oil and gas industry offshore, 55 euros per ton at the moment, and it works. During the last decades, we have reduced CO2 emissions from the producing of oil and gas, so that we at the moment have approximately 50% less emissions from the Norwegian continental shelves compared to other oil and gas regions in the world. And so it's one example how a carbon tax can work if it's done proper.
Great. That's what we call in the TV business a promo for our panel after lunch. So many thanks for that. And thank you very much, Chanel, for your input to us from Twitter and from the audience. So let's thank the excellencies, the panelists, for this very, very interesting exchange.